So today we are going to be doing a hybrid dimensional balayage technique, which incorporates foils with mostly balayage, highs and lows, and painting them into the hair. Because now, heading into fall, everyone is going to go a little darker, more lived in. So this technique is really good to kind of incorporate the two techniques and get your clients in and out of the chair faster with beautiful, luxurious hair. So obviously I'm gonna be using the Moroccan oil color, and I'm gonna be talking about their new launch, which is chocolates. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest launches with them, because I know a lot of my balayagers out there love the deep, the depth, dimension, and just the richness of the colors. So I'm so excited to be showing you this. So I'm gonna dive right in and get started and tell you what I'm using first before I really go into the tips and the techniques and tricks, all that I have with foiling and also painting the highs and lows into the hair. Okay, so first, what we're gonna be doing is we are gonna start off with the face frame of the client, which is my beautiful mannequin back here. We are going to place the foils around the hairline for that nice kind of bold, subtle pop that a lot of, I feel like, the lived-in clients are looking for. They want something just kind of bright, but then they still wanna feel a lot more lived in toward the back with some of those nice pretty ribbons in the hair. So when I incorporate these two techniques, I always, especially around the hairline too, I always like to start really low, because we're also going to be hand painting the balayage highs in as well. So I'm going to be starting off with Moroccan oil Blonde Voyage Lightener with 10 volume. For me, I like a little bit of a thicker consistency, especially when you foil around the face. Those pieces are finer, they're prone to more, breakage. So we want to make sure we keep the integrity and the health of the hair. So that's why I like to start low and slow. They even also have a 5 volume, which you can even use for a 5 volume for your clients that have a natural light base color. So for me, I like to use a mixture of 1:1, because I like a little bit of that thicker consistency, and I know I'm going to get full saturation for a really nice even lift. So as you can see, this is how kind of thick it's like a really thicker kind of like cream cheese consistency, because if you make your lightener too thin, you're not building up saturation, and therefore it's not going to get you a nice level of lift. Okay, so I'm going to just put this on my tray, and I will tell you what I'm going to be mixing when I get to the next part of the hand painting and dimensional colors here. So I'm going to be using Moroccan oil came out with these cute foils in collaboration with Fraymar. So we're going to be using the pop-up embossed foils today. And again, this is the only thing that we're going to be doing with foiling is around the hairline, okay? So this technique, if you are just tuning in, we're going to be doing a hybrid method today in the use of foils and hand painting balayage, highs and lows. So if you ever have a client that really wants to be more lived in, more dimensional, kind of want to tone down a little bit, but keep her face frame really nice and bright, a lot of the times, a lot of the stylists out there really like to use foils. And one of the reasons is they want to be completely solid, bright around the face. I mean, you don't have to have it at a level 10, but they wanted that nice solid and that really nice pop of that face frame pieces. So I am going to section out about a 1-inch section from her part line, and I'm just going to kind of eyeball to see where I want to start with my sectioning. Now, a little tip that I like to tell a lot of my students is that if you are ever experiencing a client that might have a sparse hairline, where that receding hairline is, what I like to do is almost, well, obviously she's a mannequin, so she doesn't have that. But if you are have a client that experienced it, and they will have that recession right in this area, what I like to do is almost kind of take a, kind of like an L shape, kind of like a little bit of a diagonal back, and then kind of cut right behind that ear. So kind of almost like this, because what's gonna happen is if all this is really, really sparse, when they pull their hair back, they want to still see those little pieces of lightness around the hairline when they pull their hair back, and they don't want to experience a black hole kind of in there. Now, consultation is really important. That you want to might ask your clients, do you want to see the sparkles of those highs kind of going back when you pull your hair up? Sometimes you might not have to worry about that because some people won't need to pull their hair up. So definitely consult with your clients to make sure if they do want to see a nice even light hairline with the different highs in there. Make sure that you are kind of getting all of this in here to achieve that. But she has a really solid hairline, so we are just kind of gonna go back to around the top of the ear and then pin that away. So this is all gonna be foils. And the rest, we are going to hand paint the highs and also hand paint the lows, okay? So I'm gonna come over here so that way you guys can see that. And again, we are using Blonde Voyage Lightener. We're starting with a lower developer. We're using a 10 volume. Again, you can also use a 5 volume as well, which is really nice. They have a 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, and 40 volume developer. Okay, which is really nice, especially when you're doing a lot of blondes. Okay, so usually my go-to is, even if I am incorporating slices, I will always start off with a weave around the face. Because again, a lot of the times our clients have a very sparse hairline and they don't want to see a line of demarcation around the face. They want it very natural, okay? So we are just gonna start out. Now, I would obviously do this a little bit closer if it was my client, but you know how mannequins are. They have a really funny hairline. Okay, so what I'm gonna be doing is, and I'm also gonna be locking my foils around the hairline so that way those foils do not slip. And if I had a really, really thick client and they had a lot of hair, I might actually start working my way from the bottom, going all the way up till about where the head starts curving a little bit in the back, just so some of my balayage pieces can lift a little bit more. But since for her, we are only doing more of, I would say, a custom partial or just very minimal highs in the hair, that's why I'm starting in the front, okay? So I wanna make sure I really load my lightener in. Again, that's why I really love using a thicker consistency lightener so I can really make sure this is all saturating. Now, when I say lock my foils, if you've seen me before on Instagram, you know that I love to lock my foils, especially around the hairline. So this is what's happened. If I have a little bit of slippage or my foil kind of pulled down a little bit, I will just gently go about a third of the way up, and then I'm gonna go over top of the hairline of where that foil is, over top of that foil line, and then I'm gonna go under, take that little flap and push it to where it now meets, and then fold my foils inward. Okay, so therefore it's good if you like to apply color in between. If you are moving the hair around a lot, those foils aren't going anywhere. Okay, so what I want to do normally too is I always like to take a slice first, because that will ensure with my weave, I'm going to have even consistency throughout that whole section. If I was just taking this and I'm just weaving it here, it might be thinner here, thicker here, and I'm not going to get an even lift. So I always like to kind of slice my section first and then go in and weave. Now, you can approach the hairline, I would say, a little bit more close together because you want a little bit more of that solidness around the face. So sometimes I don't even leave any hair out in between because the hairline is a lot finer in general. And then what I'll do here is I'll probably, this is really over lightened, so I might even just pick some of those pieces out so that way they don't get compromised. And then a lot of the times, even with my blondes, I actually do even like a lot of slices. Sometimes I do a lot of back-to-back slices, which I'll probably show you up in the front area and how to diffuse that to make a really beautiful, gradual, but solid and bright face frame. Okay. Now, if you were experiencing too a client that had a lot of very, very dark color, permanent color in the hair, I would not fold my foils because everyone knows that lifting from a darker level, or even if you are having a color correction with a lot of box color in the hair, if you fold them, even though you might fold them gently, it might produce an even lift with the fold creases. So I tend to just place another foil on top so that way it's going to consistently lift instead of having maybe a darker area in that crease line. So I'm just making sure I kind of work up around the hairline, taking my slice and then go in and weave. Now, another thing that you can do to make it a little bit more seamless, if you are a little bit scared of doing more slices, you can for sure do an all over weave around the hairline. And then in between, you can do more of a tip out in that front. So that way, if someone wants it a little bit more seamless and lived in, but as it kind of goes down, they want it nice and bright, especially when you curl away your face. It has all that lightness under here. This is where you're gonna need to brighten because, again, if for a section to be more bold and more pronounced, you need more back-to-back sections to create a solid section. You ever get a client in your chair and it's a blonde hair client and they come to you and they say, I'm not blonde. And you're thinking to yourself, like, yes, you are. You have level 10 highlights throughout the hair. But what the problem is, the client doesn't feel bright enough. And what's happening is, even though they might have a level 10 highlighted pieces, it's not back-to-back solidness. So it has a lot of that, maybe that natural kind of blended in, like a natural basic 2000s highlight. So what you need to do is you really have to go in and do more solid sections to really make those pieces stand out. So that's why I do like to tip out my sections, kind of go through around the face, even some of the sections that I teach. I do a weave and tease, and I actually place them, it's more of either like 2 or 3 foils back to back. To create more of those ribbon-like pieces, even with the use of foils. Okay, so all this we can tip out. Now, also, if you have a client, if you do a lot of like shags, if they have a lot of layers, or a lot of bright face, a lot of shorter pieces around the face, just take in consideration if they want something that's a continuous bright face frame from the shortest pieces to the long, you're gonna have to probably take underneath sections to making sure that it's a continuous flow of a face frame. Because if you did all this boldness just right in this area, and then you get back, you blow dry them, and they kind of like curl their hair away from their face, you're gonna see that it's all dark back here, and they wanted that continuous flow. So what you would have to do in this section is kind of go back further and incorporate some of this underneath section and to make that nice and bright and bold. Okay, so we're working up, and this is so easy. I love hand painting balayaging. I just think it's so quick, it's so customizable. I think it's faster than foils. Now, of course, it depends on what the client is coming in with, what they want to achieve. But even with the Blonde Voyage clay, you can get 9 levels of lift if you know how to properly mix it and saturate your section. Okay, so we're starting here. And as you notice that I've already parted my mannequin here, so I usually go off the natural part. If they parted it in the middle or they like to flip their hair, I would probably part them in the middle. But if you have a client that has a prominent part line, I like to kind of go off the part instead of doing any type of foil work down the middle. I always feel like the sides of the head should be sisters, not twins. Save that for early 2000s. So that's just me. I feel like it should be really natural, really lived in. So as you can see here, I'll put it a little bit closer. If you're ever experiencing a lot of lighter pieces, you can either A, pick them out and push it away, or if you just want to pick out the dark and put another foil on top to lay it on just the dark areas. But this is pretty easy enough where I'm just going to kind of flip those lighter pieces away because, again, we don't want to ruin the integrity of the hair. Okay. So again, this is the only foil work that we're actually going to be doing with this hybrid dimensional color technique that I like to do. And make sure you guys stick around for the lightning part because I have a lot of tips and tricks on how to get full saturation and a really good lift when you hand paint your client. Okay. And then another little tip is that I like to do is when I am tipping out and I have a client, if I'm going to tip out a bunch of different sections throughout the hair to make sure that if they say they want more of that ombre look and they want it just really bright and solid on the ends, or even if they want dimensional color, and I know I'm gonna be tipping out a good amount in each section, and if they are, I should say, if they're not blonde, so if they're pretty dark-ish, medium brown, I do like to tip out as I go within my section. I mean, I am a foil puller, so that means that as each section is done, I will go in and scrape off the excess lightener as those foils are becoming done. And I kind of I can apply new lightener on the ends and kind of making sure I kind of lift those ends a little bit. From the summer, some people might get brassy or if they're just a little bit darker in general. And I kind of like to tip out at the ends as I go. But if you have, those dark head clients and you don't like to necessarily foil pull, this has happened early on in my career when I first started doing tip outs. I did all my foil sections really nice. Then at the very, very end, I went to go tip out, and she was a darker headed client. And at that time, I didn't even know what foil pulling is. We really didn't do it. And so I went to go check each of the sections, and all my foils that I initially placed were really, really light. But then you got those other foils that I just tipped out at the very end, and they were still stuck in that brassy stage. So if you like to, if you are more of a rinser instead of a foil puller, I would definitely consider tipping out kind of as you go, so that way you don't run into that problems. And then sometimes I don't like to add a higher volume, depending on that client. You don't want to ruin the integrity of the hair, and that's for sure what it's all about, is don't push your boundaries, and you don't want to ruin their hair. You want to keep it to, its full integrity. So I'm just going to pick out this really blonde piece, and I'm probably going to do one more foil after this. Make sure I really coat it. Now too, as you can see, which is actually good that we're almost done, in my salon right now. I mean, it is summer, so it's a little bit humid. If you know me, I am definitely not a cold person. But sometimes depending on where you live, if it's like summer, fall, whatever, it might be a little bit humid. So I always make sure that I mix like 30 grams or it's 1 ounce of lightener at a time, because you don't want the lightener to either get too puffy or you don't want it to expand too much. And a lot of humid areas, any type of lightener will do that. So even with my balayage lightener, making sure that you only mix a little bit at a time to make sure too that it has its full power in them. Okay, actually we're gonna stop here. And then what we're gonna do to have a really nice, pretty gradients of that light, and it's almost like your insurance for blonding. So if I wanna tip out some of these pieces, now you don't have to go crazy. So I'm gonna probably doing 2 sections. I'm gonna take, in this section of the hair left out, the most outer pieces. So if you think of this, so I'm gonna be basically split that in half and take all this hair and go away. So I'm gonna take some of this, bring this over here, kind of just seeing how many foils that I need. All right. So I'm gonna split this up into 2 foils. And what I'm gonna be doing is anytime that I'm tipping out, I'm gonna be over directing the hair, because what's gonna happen is, so even if I apply my lightener straight on, so if I don't do a blend, if I don't do a slant, so that means starting higher at one point and lower to the other, if I just put it right here, if I then put it to its natural fall, look what's gonna happen. It's gonna all make that really nice, pretty gradient section for me already. So this is kind of like your insurance. So I'm gonna split this in 2. And you can take as many sections as you need to making sure your section is not too thick, okay? And then I'm just going to be pushing all those little baby hairs away. And what I like to do in the salon too, if I have a client that their hair is so thin or too healthy, which is always a good thing, I get a little of my Moroccan oil dry texture spray and spray it right on here to just give me a little bit of grit in order for me to kind of push those baby hairs away, or if you are doing a deep tease, and it just kind of helps me aid in kind of making those pieces stay put. Okay, so then you can apply. I didn't grab my board. I usually sometimes highlight a board, but that's okay. But yeah, so you're just gonna tip out those sections and over direct those sections. And again, I took the most outer parts of those front face framing pieces. And then again, make sure you don't take these too thick, because whenever I see someone foil and they take a really thick section and they're gonna be like, oh, let me feather up, right? So I'm gonna feather up really nice and pretty, and it all looks beautiful, right, as they're applying it. But what's gonna happen is, if, number one, if that section is too thick and you just blended this up here, now if you're gonna do a heavier color melt, sure, okay, that works. But what's gonna happen is that section in this blending area is not gonna be fully saturated, right? Because they just kind of blended it upward. All that, let's see if I can show you up. All this section under here, it's not gonna be fully saturated. So what's gonna happen is that section is going to turn and get stuck in that nice orange stage for you. And we don't want that. So what I like to do is, again, making sure you take a thin enough sections, especially if you're working with blondes. They don't want any warmth in the hair, and you want that max lift. You can always turn your brush and really kind of get in there. If you did take a little bit of thicker section, really get in there, push that lightener through to the other side. But now, since I'm kind of wiping off that product almost, kind of go back in and then reapply just to where you kind of made sure you saturated that transition zone. And then we'll kind of fold that over. And then I can pin that away. Now this is my second section. So now you can also weave this, or you can take a full on basically slice of this, depending on how bold your client wants it, those face framing pieces to be. So I'm gonna push all that away. And then you can also see, where do you want that boldness to start? So if you put this back in this original position, say if she wants it really, really lived in right to about her eye, I know that I'm gonna have to really start here to making sure that it's going to achieve the most boldness that your client wants. So don't be afraid to take some of that hair, put it in its original place, and just kind of eyeball it and see exactly where you want those light pieces to be. I'm kind of digging my brush a little bit into that section right up top. I kind of like always do this just to really ensure if I'm not taking a super, super thin section. Making sure I really saturate my lightener. If your lightener gets a little too oily for you, I always kind of like to have a backup at my station of a little lightener. And sometimes if it gets too thinned out, or if I know it's been a while until I mix up, I kind of sprinkle a little bit of that lightener right into my mixture. Okay. All right, so that's it for the foil section. So we did a couple face framing highlights and 2 tip out sections. So these are the only 2 tip out sections that we over directed. So we are just gonna kind of pin that back and making sure, you know, it's out of our client's way to the best that we can. So I'll kind of flip a little bit of those foils back. So that way the hair is not bothering our client. Okay, now let's get to the fun stuff. So we are going to be doing hand painting highs and lows. So we are going to be using now the Balayage clay, and for me, I always mix with 40 volume. It is a clay lightener. It's a little bit more, I should say, it's not going to be in a heat incubated foil, so it's usually with 40 volume. I never have any problems with it. On extreme blonde hair, yes, use to your best advantage of how you want to formulate that. But we're going to be using the Balayage clay, and I know it's mixed to 1 to like 1.5. For me, I am a very thick painter, and I will mix it 1 to 1. Why am I a thick painter? Is because sometimes if your balayage lightener is too loose, and if you start to hand paint those sections, it can't build up onto the hair to make it lift. So usually a rule of thumb is if you can see through your section, you're not gonna get max lift, and it's not gonna get light. You wanna make sure that you thicker enough to making sure that it stays moist inside longer, so that way it's still working. Because if you ever notice when you do a balayage and you feather up and you're like, oh my gosh, this looks so beautiful, right? And it probably does, but what's gonna happen when you start swiping up? It's not a lot of saturation. And what's gonna happen? It's gonna dry out in probably 10 minutes and it's barely gonna lift, right? So that's why I really focus on how to apply it, and the consistency is so important when you balayage your client. Also, when you take if you have a thinner mixture, it can't build on top of the hair, so therefore it's almost gonna sink in the hair shaft and cause bleeding and splotches. But for me, I do a lot of dark hair balayage clients, so I need to apply my lightener a little bit thicker, so that way it stays moister longer as it's processing, okay? So I'm gonna mix and I'll show you here in a second, of my mixture, and you're probably gonna be like, oh my God, I could never paint like that. But you would be very surprised of how this kind of, I should say, loosens up a little bit. And I always like to mix it with a spatula for me, so that, because I am a thick painter, it kind of gets caught in the whisk a little bit. So I kind of mix that slow and slow and really make sure all those lumps and bumps are out. And I always use a board, and I have a lot of tricks too on using a board as well. So this is the consistency of my clay. Okay, it's almost like the block of cream cheese consistency. Okay. And also too, if you didn't notice, that Morocco came out with their bigger tubs now instead of the bags, because a lot of people did like to use more of the scoop. So they also came out with these beautiful tubs in sizes, and this is 32 ounces, which is amazing. And then also with my clay, we are using in chocolate. So we're gonna be hand painting our lowlights into the hair. We are gonna be using 4.9 in color Calypso. These are a liquid demi. And I feel like even though I'm using a 4, it has a lot of reflection. So I feel like if you are used to a certain color line, it's not gonna be like dark, 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 right? So with a liquid demi for me, when I switched over to Moroccan oil, I almost had to kind of get used to the levels, because I never used a liquid really before, and I am obsessed. My stylists are obsessed, and these colors are so rich. So if you're just tuning in, Moroccan oil just launched the chocolate series for their line, and oh, they're amazing. Okay, you can tell I really love them. Okay, so I'll show you the consistency. And I have a lot of tips and tricks on also how to hand paint your lowlights into the hair. And game changer, it is so easy. I can get through a full head in about 30 minutes flat. Okay. So also working with a thicker lightener, I kind of use these little spatulas. And what I like to do is, if I'm a righty, so I'll apply the lightener on the left side of my board and kind of get a nice flat surface. So therefore, when I paint, I can just kind of grab a scoop and be done with it. So I am gonna use my gloves. And what I like to do is in between my sections, you can use a plastic wrap, balayage film. It just really helps keep the sections also incubated for a lift, and also keeps it really clean. If you are doing a balayage, I also like to do the balayage film over their shoulder, especially if they have long hair, because there's nothing unprofessional like a really messy cape if you can help it. So let me get that quick. And we are ready to go. And then if you have any questions, feel free to also DM me on my Instagram at JessicaScottHair, and I can answer any questions that you may have as well. Okay, so hand painting highs and lows. So again, really custom placement here. As you can see, she does have some highs in her hair. She has some depth, but I'm gonna show you kind of the basic kind of technique that I really love to use when doing hand painting that really makes a difference. Now, also, if you have a client that is really over lightened, and sometimes they say, oh, I don't feel light enough. Sometimes even if you add a little bit of that dark is really gonna make the blonde pop. Because again, if you do too much highlights, it's just gonna look too blended, and it's not gonna have that wow popping factor. Okay, so what I'm gonna be doing here is I'm gonna kind of see exactly where I need to place any highs. So usually, okay, so we're gonna be doing more of this partial here. So what I like to do is, I like to kind of go diagonal back with all of my sections when I hand paint. So really simple, really easy. Okay, I'm gonna start kind of where, again, where the natural curve lays. I'm gonna pin that up. Now what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna take a thick enough section, so anywhere between a 1/2 inch to 1 inch size section, because again, you want to be able to really have the clay lightener stay on top of the hair strand, okay? So I'm gonna take a pretty thick section. I'm gonna split that into two so I can have a little bit more control. So I'm gonna pin this away for a second. So again, my thick slice here, my thick section, and I'm gonna pin that back. And this is where I'm gonna place my lows. Because again, when you put the light over top of the dark, it's gonna make it pop. So I'm gonna take this. Now, you can either do this one or two ways, depending on how dark they want it, how bold they want it. I actually love to surface paint my lowlights. If you haven't ever tried that, I definitely suggest you should. Now, depending on also what the client wants. Do they want their section going all the way to the bottom? Do they want more of internal depth with bright pops of ends? So that's what we're gonna be doing here. We're gonna keep the ends a little bit more brighter. So we're not going to paint all this to the very, very end. So what I like to do is making sure that you have a really good tension, because there's nothing worse than if you if you take your hand and go all the way down and start painting, you lost all your attention, and therefore the color is going to seep in. Same thing applies to the clay lightener. So I'm gonna start really close to where I'm actually going to start painting. So you can see this a little bit better. And then I'm going to take my 4.9, which is again, the chocolate demi-liquid, and I barely have anything on here. I don't want a big glop on here, so therefore it's gonna seep in, very light. And what I'm gonna be doing is very light strokes. Very, very light strokes on top. Now, if this was a client, I would probably use this color to also color melt her on the root area when she's done to melt that in. And then what I'm gonna be doing is start to feather my hands down and work my hands down as each section is complete. And then when I end at the end, I'm gonna be doing a little bit more of a slant, so I'm gonna apply the darker color toward more of the back of the hair, because that's what a lot of that lived in color is, a little bit more deeper in the back and a little bit lighter around the front. So now, as you can see, if you can see that pretty nice blend. And then what I'm gonna be doing is taking my film and then just ever so slightly place it right on top. Okay, so that is the dark section. And this is the light section that I took right on top of that. Now I'm going to split this up into two sections. The reason why is, if I paint, that's what I was telling you about, if I paint and feather up, I'm not gonna get those bold dimensional pieces throughout my hair. So in order to get some more bold pieces, I have to have more control of my sections. So usually I kind of like to start from the back, work my way forward so that I can like place it away if I need it to. So same thing applies. I'm gonna put the lightener on the one side of the board. And again, I like to keep some of my clay lightener on the side. So if it does ever have that too shiny sheen on it, I like to add a little bit more to thicken it up a bit. So again, this is that middle section of the hair, which a lot of clients don't really see. So I like to start a little bit lower with my light. Okay, so I'll kind of start here and really perfect that section before I go down. So do you see how thick I'm applying it? Very, very light strokes. Now you basically don't want to feel the bristles of the brush hit the hair. If it does, you're basically wiping that product off, okay? So just take that in consideration when you paint. You really want to only feel the lightener going onto the hair. and then kind of work my way down. And then I'll show you what I mean by, as I was saying, when you feather up. So usually I see a lot of stylists kind of feather up, and it's okay, but it depends on what you want. So if I'm feathering up really nice and pretty, it's gonna make for a beautiful transition zone, don't get me wrong. But since that is so thin on top of that, it can't build up. This section is gonna dry out really, really fast. So just take that in consideration depending on how much lift you really want in the hair, and you got to really make sure you build that lightener up onto the hair strand. Now, if you are working with a board, never apply your board like this. Why? What's going to happen is this is a horizontal line. When you lift up the hair to check underneath, you're going to get a nice line of demarcation. So it doesn't matter how long the hair is, put it on corner to corner. And then, therefore, you can really paint the hair. And again, it doesn't matter how long the hair is. And you can get a really nice, even paint with those bold sections, because now I'm saturating the underneath side of this section. And I'll show you here in a second what I mean by that. So if I lift this up, I want to make sure that there's no harsh lines of demarcation. Just blend it out if you do, and then kind of paint away. Now it is very humid in my salon. I actually forgot to turn the air on. So I'm gonna start adding a little bit more of my clay into my bowl, because I do like, again, a little bit of that thicker paint, so that way it can really build on top of that hair shaft. And that's what I was talking about, depending on what climate you live in. If you really live in a really humid climate, again, I like to use or keep a little bit of that clay on hand, so that way it doesn't expand too much. Okay, so I can preload my board. And always make sure you have a nice towel on handy, because a messy paint, you're gonna get a messy application. So I always like to have a towel on hand. You can always wipe off your brush if you need to. Okay, so I'm gonna do this section here. And again, all these sections are on top of that dark that we just painted. Okay, so you really wanna make sure you hold with tight tension. Again, and you never wanna feel the bristles of the brush on your hair. If you want that max brightness, because you wanna load on that saturation. And you almost wanna perfect that section before you start working your finger down. Because again, there's nothing worse if you start painting or holding your hands down here and you paint here, you're gonna lose all that tension, and you have a better chance of pushing that product throughout the hair shaft, therefore causing bleeding and splotchiness. So you can even paint really, really bold, so that way you can actually see the dimension in your hair. Working it down. And that's why I do like to I kind of split up that sliced section. So again, I have better control of my section. The bigger section that you take, you're gonna have less control of. And what I like to do too is, if you are not a balayager, and I was talking about doing more of that blending work, that's a really good technique for that feathering blend. If you have a client that comes in, they might have either permanent color, or if they want to just lighten their hair, maybe 2 levels, that's a good way to kind of do all of that throughout the hair, that feathering technique, just to ever so slightly lighten the hair without having to deal with any color remover or anything like that. It's a very pretty blend, and you have that nice sparkle highlights in there. Okay. So again, I'm gonna be doing probably exactly like these 2 sections here, 2 more sections, and that is it for the side. So again, I'll show you here my sectioning kind of in the front area. And you wanna leave a little bit of hair out in between from the front where I put the highlights in to that first section of highs that I'm painting. So this is a highlight right here. So I wanna make sure I kind of go a little bit back from that because this is already so bright. You need a little bit of the depth in there to make that pop. So what I want to make sure that I do is I'm going to just kind of, just for your guys' eyes, I'm just going to kind of push this away and then start my first main paint of that light here. Okay, so this is my slice for the highs of my balayage. And then this under here is going to be where I'm painting the lows. And now that you already have a piece of plastic wrap here, just place the hair right on top when it's done. Okay, so I'm going to hold this really kind of tight. Again, tension, tension, tension. And really kind of just ever so slightly kind of feather that right onto the top of the hair. I mean, you can do this with the color Calypso, you can do this with the color Rhapsody, which is their permanent color. They also have a 5 volume, like I said before, so you can even take that color if they have even like a really heavy grays. But also too, speaking of grays, even if they had some sparkles in the hair, this has some gray coverage in it, more gray blending. I use it for my little sparkles on my roots. So I half the time use the Demi-Permanent for more of the gray blending for myself. So take that in consideration. If you ever have that blonde hair client and she comes in and it's like, my hair is too orange and you can never get that bright blonde in there, and you do a root color to cover their grays with very minimal gray. So I would try even doing the color Calypso for that. Okay. Loading up my board. So just make sure you take this. And again, we're gonna start higher here and a little bit lower on a slant going back. Okay, so make sure you have that tension and you're really building up each section. Again, like cream cheese, toothpaste. Because if you see the hair underneath this section, you are not going to get the lift that you might want. I'm going to start sliding my hands down as I am working. So that way I'm going to basically perfect it and then keep sliding my hands down. Now, if you don't want to use a board like this to saturate the underneath, this is definitely going to make it brighter because now you're saturating it on both sides. But I have done it where they don't really necessarily want the ends a lot brighter. You can definitely just apply it right to the very top of it, because underneath is where you're gonna have depth. So your section size in between is gonna determine too how much depth you also are leaving. Okay. Try to turn this around so you guys can see. So again, this is the hair that's left out because it's the front face pieces are right there with the highs. And again, you need a little bit of that depth in there to make that blonde pop. Okay, scoop a little bit and really start applying very lightly. Now when I do that, I'm really not, as you saw me, I kind of went like this. I kind of just smooth out that top layer and the sides. I'm not pushing the product into the hair. I'm just kind of making sure that it's all really nice and smooth. And that's another thing too. If you want that dimensional color and that bright pop of blonde, make sure it's completely saturated even from the top to the bottom. Unless you're doing a really heavy color melt and gonna be blending any lines out. Because if you don't apply it as thick as you are up top to the bottom, it's gonna be warmer up here. So again, you wanna really build up that saturation to get that brightness. Okay, then kind of go on a slant. And then apply my board side to side, never horizontal, because you're gonna get that line of demarcation on the back end of the hair. You can lift it up to making sure that you have a nice even blend, and then plop it right on top of that balayage film. And then when you are applying the film, making sure that you really don't push, all you have to do is really do it really lightly. Don't push it in because you don't want to push that lightener into the section. Again, balayage means to paint, so you're surface painting. You never want it to really fully get into the hair, on the other side, I should say. Okay, so this is going to be our last section. So don't be afraid to really kind of take your section as you go and really see where you want the light to start, where you want the depth at. And it really kind of helps you kind of visually see and where you decide you want placement. So that's why I'm not very big on sectioning, even with my foils, because I want to kind of visualize the outcome of what my client wants. So I don't always go to a certain parting. I kind of go off the head shape because everyone has different head shapes and where they want the depth, where they want the highs. So let me just see. I'm going to take this. Actually, I might do a little bit on top, but that's that very, very last piece. Okay, I'm going to push this away. Okay, so this will be my section. Let me kind of put it down for you guys so you can see where this is going. Okay, so now I'm going to do a slice where that's going to be the light. I'm going to push that away, and this is where I'm going to do the painted on lows. Okay, so yes, even though this is a big section, it's probably bigger than what I just took, I'm only surface painting, and this is actually really good if you have a client that you are balayaging and want them to get and to try more a lived-in look. If you are hand painting and you see a foil line as you're painting and you know you're not going to touch that, take a little bit of your dark, and as you are balayaging, just take a little bit and kind of paint this section of dark and this section of light. I can probably actually show you on that next section when I'm going to be adding the light as well, so you know what I'm talking about. But it's a really good way to blend out your foil lines if you want them to kind of get into that lived-in look. I feel like back when balayage and more of the lived-in looks became an actual thing, right? And I think it was like pretty hard for clients to really like their roots and like that rootiness. All right, so very, very lightly, barely touching the hair. I'm gonna work my way down, keeping a little bit of lightness on the bottom toward the face and kind of going a little bit darker as I go on toward the backside. Now this is gonna give you a really nice, pretty blend. If you decide, or if you have a client that really wants those bold, deep sections, you can even kind of do like a scoop of a section, maybe like an 1.5 to 2 inch wide, and actually completely saturate that from top to bottom. I even did that in the past if they really want those bold, deep, dimensional pieces. Okay. And this section here. Okay, so this is the very top. Actually, no, I'm gonna leave a little bit of halo right on top. So this is what I'm gonna be leaving on top of here. It's a very, very thin veil. So if you have a client that really wants and almost that really rooted, you can even I would even paint that with the dark a little bit to kind of create a veil over top. Okay, so what I was talking about in doing a combo between your two sections and using a clay lightener and then also adding in a little depth on the one side to say, again, pretend they have lines of demarcation from old highlights. So I'm going to reload my board again, making sure my brush is cleaned off. Okay, so what I'm gonna be doing, I'm going to be getting my dark, putting on one side very, very lightly of my section. So I'm gonna go down a little bit, but you don't wanna go down too far where you're not gonna have that tension. And now I'm gonna take my clay and do light on the one side. So again, this is a really good technique if you are wanting to add interior depth or blend out existing highlighted pieces that have a line of demarcation to it. And then as you go, now you can even too work this all the way down if you want to really add depth within your section. Okay. And then again, side to side with your board and really load that on because now it's going to cover the back side to make those ends pop. Okay. Now I'll show you again on this side. I'll load up my board one more time. So what I'm gonna do is really tight tension. So as you can see, this section is a big, large blonde section. So take my Calypso, really tight tension, really very ever so slightly skim the surface. Again, staying in with each section. So I don't want to go all the way down just yet because again, tension is key. I probably will say that another 20 times, but making sure that you have really, really thick saturation. And how I started painting thicker when I wasn't really trained in hand painting, it's almost like you want to make sure you kind of create almost like a dome on your brush. And the way I started out was almost kind of like going back to kindergarten, very early on technique. So I almost kind of want to create like a little C shape, and I kind of want to kind of go down my section and almost do a little tap C's kind of going down. This is what's going to kind of like really ever so slightly, because what is going to happen, again, it's going to build that lightener onto the hair. If you keep brushing if you keep swiping like this, see how that's not, I mean, it's kind of hard to see, but it's not saturated. I can see hair underneath that section. So the whole idea is building up the lightener on the hair so that way it can continue to process and get the maximum level of lightness that you are achieving. It's all about saturation. And I'll actually show you in a visual here in a second to show you what I mean, which actually kind of takes things in perspective of why saturation is so important. Okay, side to side with my board. Okay. Now I'm going to show you on my balayage board here really quick what I mean by saturation. So let me just add a little bit more of my lightener to my bowl. I should have turned my air on at the salon. It's all right though. All right, let me just get a little bit going in here. So usually for me, I can achieve anywhere from a 10 volume lift to a 40 volume lift, all by using one bowl of 40 volume developer in one bowl, okay? So what I'm gonna be doing, if you want the lowest, here, I'm gonna show you here. If you want the lowest level of lift, it's gonna look very, very thin. That's almost like you're blending, how I was talking about. If someone blends really, really nice, you're barely gonna get a lift. That's what you're doing on that hair. So if you see those pretty strokes and they're very, very light, you're not gonna get a good lift. Okay, so now we're gonna work our way up. And this, I think, the visual, I mean, I'm a very visual person, so I feel like it makes all the difference of how I'm talking about the saturation component. That's why I mix my lightener thicker, because it will stay moist on top of that hair shaft for longer and therefore get max saturation and more levels of lift. Okay. 10 volume, 20 volume, 30 volume, 40 volume, okay? You're very, very blendy balayagers, barely any lightener on top of the hair strand. You're not gonna get a lift because it's gonna dry out. So that's how I mean by how I control my level of lift, determining my saturation. I hope this helps because back in the day, everyone's like, you gotta saturate. And we're like, well, yeah, I am saturating. But that's what I mean. If you take your lightener and you're almost doing little C taps. Now, this is just to start out to give you an idea of what it feels like to mix with a thicker lightener. If you kind of take little C taps going, you are not touching the brush on the hair shaft. So if you are one to feel the bristles of the brush, you're wiping that product off when you touch the bristles on the hair. Therefore, you're almost making it like a 10 or 20 volume. I don't want to touch the bristles on my brush onto the hair. I don't want to wipe it off. I want to build onto it. So that's why I take little taps going along the hair. I hope that makes sense. And I hope you guys really try mixing with the thicker consistency because game changer. Okay, so one more section here, and this is gonna be my veil. If you ever haven't done a veil, it's really pretty. You can do it really thin if you want. Again, take that thick, bring this closer here. So this is gonna be just a cascading veil if they want a little bit of that depth within the root area, or you can actually save this too if you like a deeper melt area. You could save it for a heavier root melt. But if you're not doing so much of a heavier root melt, if you still want those pops to really pop out, then you can always do a veil. Really, really thin, kind of going to how further down you like. I still want it to kind of be a little bit more light, so I'm gonna go about halfway down and then go further down on the one side, just so I can have that nice little veil. Okay, so that's for my hybrid blonding. Again, I can get through the head in like 30 minutes. It's really simple if you just take in consideration the tips and techniques. Let me kind of just show you real quick. This is what your application should look like on a hand-painted client. If you are wanting many levels of lift, I paint a little bit bolder and you really want to coat that. Notice that you can't see any hair underneath this section. That is the perfect consistency for your lightener if you want to go light. So saturation and application is key. Tiny strokes, work your fingers down as you go, and it's going to make all the difference in the world because again, you are going to see that this is going to take very, very, very long to dry out compared to this right here, which is our Mach 10 volume. You can see the board underneath this lightener, so it's not gonna get you that lift compared to this, which is this, it's gonna get you many levels of lift. So yeah, so if you are in the Las Vegas area too, make sure you check out and go over to Moroccan Pro's page. I'm gonna be at the Collective teaching my different blonding techniques, lived-in techniques, and with the Moroccan oil artists. So for more information on the Collective in Las Vegas, make sure you check out Moroccan Oil's Pro page for all of the information and details regarding that. And if you are there, I cannot wait to see you. It's gonna be a blast with so much amazing education.